The following is independent geopolitical analysis and personal opinion only. Nothing in this video constitutes official reporting, breaking news, or verified intelligence. All sources referenced are publicly available. I could be wrong. This is analysis and nothing more, nothing less. Here is a question most analysts are not asking right now. What happens to Russia's war machine the moment Japan, one of the most financially disciplined, legally cautious, and historically pacifist nations on Earth, quietly decides that it has seen enough? Because something just shifted in the Pacific, and the reverberations are being felt in Moscow in ways that most Western commentary is almost entirely missing. This is not about weapons. This is not about boots on the ground. This is about something far more structural, far more permanent, and in my analysis, far more dangerous too. Vladimir Putin's long-term position than anything Ukraine has fired across the front line in months. Stay with me, because by the end of this analysis, you are going to see this conflict through a completely different lens. In my analysis, Japan's recent moves toward Ukraine represent one of the most underreported strategic pivots of this entire war. And to understand why it matters so much, we need to spend just a moment on context. Because a lot of people watching this may not have the full backstory, and without that foundation, the significance of what Japan has done simply does not land the way it should. Japan, for most of the post-World War II era, has operated under a constitutional framework that severely limits its capacity to engage in anything resembling offensive military action or direct support for combatants in active conflicts. Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution, drafted in the aftermath of the Second World War, essentially renounced war as a sovereign right and prohibited the maintenance of war potential. For decades, this made Japan one of the most legally constrained major economies on the planet when it came to geopolitical involvement in foreign conflicts. Japan could trade, Japan could diplomate, Japan could sanction, but Japan could not arm. That was the understood boundary. That was the line that had held, more or less, for nearly 80 years. According to publicly available reporting from outlets including the Financial Times, Reuters, and Nikkei Asia, the Japanese government under Prime Minister Fumio Kishida and subsequently under the current administration began a quiet but unmistakable process of reinterpreting and in some cases legislatively adjusting the constraints around its defense export policies. This process did not happen overnight. It was incremental, deliberate, and in characteristic Japanese fashion. It was rolled out with minimal fanfare. But when you step back and look at the cumulative picture of what Tokyo has done since February 2022, when Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the picture is genuinely remarkable. Japan imposed some of the most sweeping export controls on Russia of any non-NATO nation on Earth. It froze Russian assets. It joined G7 sanctions packages with a consistency and a speed that surprised many analysts who had expected Tokyo to hedge, given its geographic proximity to Moscow and its long-standing interest in resolving the Kuril Islands territorial dispute with Russia. Japan did not hedge. Japan aligned, and then Japan went further. Based on public reports from the Japanese Ministry of Foreign Affairs and corroborated by coverage in outlets including the Japan Times and the Associated Press, Japan committed billions of dollars in financial assistance to Ukraine across multiple tranches. It provided humanitarian aid, reconstruction support, and economic stabilization, funding at a scale that placed it among the top tier of Ukraine's international supporters when measured in absolute financial terms. It also began providing non-lethal military equipment, a category that has quietly expanded in its definition over time, and it began working with allies to explore mechanisms by which artillery shells and other defense materiel manufactured or stockpiled in Japan could reach Ukraine through third-country transfer arrangements, navigating around the legal constraints that previously would have made such transfers impossible. Now here is what I think is really happening. And this is where I want to spend the bulk of our time today, because the surface-level reporting on Japan and Ukraine tends to stop at the financial numbers and the diplomatic statements. It tends to note that Japan has been supportive, give a figure, and move on. What is being missed, in my view, is the deeper structural significance of what Japan's posture means for Russia, not just in the context of this war, but in the context of the emerging global order that this war is in the process of constructing. Point 1. What actually happened? In my analysis, the most consequential thing Japan did was not any single financial commitment or any single policy shift. The most consequential thing Japan did was break a psychological and diplomatic precedent that Moscow had long relied upon as a form of passive security. Let me explain what I mean by that. Russia's strategic calculus for most of the post-Cold War period rested on a particular assumption about the world's major democracies, specifically the assumption that economic self-interest, geographic distance, and internal political divisions would prevent a genuinely unified international response to Russian aggression. This assumption had worked before. When Russia moved into Georgia in 2008, the international response was muted. When Russia annexed Crimea and fomented conflict in the Donbas in 2014, sanctions came, but they were limited, and many major economies, including several in Asia, simply continued doing business with Moscow more or less. As before, the assumption, in short, was that the coalition of nations willing to impose real costs on Russia would always have meaningful holes in it, and that those holes could be exploited to keep the Russian economy breathing. Japan was supposed to be one of those holes, not because Japan sympathized with Russia, but because Japan had its own strategic considerations. Japan is an island nation entirely dependent on energy imports. Japan had a territorial dispute with Russia over the Kuril Islands that it had been trying to resolve through engagement rather than confrontation for decades. Japan is geographically sandwiched between Russia and China, two nations with which it has complicated histories, and Japan had its constitutional constraints. The strategic logic from Moscow's perspective was that Japan, whatever its sympathies, would ultimately prioritize its own complex regional position and stay on the sidelines in any meaningful sense. That assumption, in my analysis, has been comprehensively shattered, and the shattering of that assumption matters enormously, because assumptions of this kind are not just about Japan, they are about what kind of world we are living in. When Moscow looks at a country like Japan, with all the reasons it had to stay neutral and sees instead a country that has imposed sweeping sanctions, committed billions in aid, shifted its defense export policies, and aligned itself unambiguously with the Western-led response to Russian aggression, what Moscow is being forced to confront is the possibility that its fundamental model of how the world works is broken. According to analysts cited in publicly available reports from think tanks including the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Stimson Center, Japan's alignment with the Ukraine response has contributed to a broader solidification of what some researchers are calling a democratic security consensus, a pattern in which countries that might previously have been expected to hedge are instead choosing clear alignment and doing so at meaningful cost to their own short-term economic interests. Japan, for instance, walked away from significant energy investments in Sakhalin, Russian-operated oil and gas projects in which Japanese companies had substantial stakes. That was not a costless decision. That was a deliberate choice to absorb economic pain in service of a broader strategic position. And in my analysis, that kind of costly signaling carries a weight that no amount of diplomatic statement-making can replicate. Point 2. Why it matters more than most people think. Here is the detail that I believe most analysis of this situation is genuinely missing, and it has to do not with what Japan has done in isolation but with what Japan's participation does to the architecture of the global coalition supporting Ukraine. Russia's most viable long-term strategy for surviving the economic pressure of Western sanctions has always depended on maintaining strong relationships with major non-Western economies, primarily China, India, and to a lesser extent, some Middle Eastern and African partners. The logic is straightforward, if Russia can root enough of its trade, energy exports, technology imports, and financial flows through economies that are not participating in the sanctions regime, it can partially offset the impact of Western pressure and sustain the war effort and the domestic economy long enough for Western political will to fracture. This strategy has had some success. China has significantly increased its purchases of Russian energy. India has done the same. Certain financial flows have been rerouted through intermediary jurisdictions, and there have been documented cases of sanctioned goods reaching Russia through third-country transfers. The strategy is not a fantasy. It is partially working, and the Russian economy, while under serious stress according to analysts at institutions including the Kiel Institute for the World Economy and the Stockholm Institute of Transition Economics, has not collapsed in the way some early optimists predicted. But here is where Japan becomes critically important in a way that goes beyond its own direct bilateral relationship with Russia. Japan is the third largest economy in the world. It is a technological and industrial powerhouse. It is a central node in global semiconductor supply chains, in advanced manufacturing networks, in financial systems that connect Asia to the rest of the world, and Japan's comprehensive adoption of export controls on Russia has had a cascading effect on how other countries in the region, particularly in Southeast Asia and among Japan's broader trade partners, calculate the risks of being seen to circumvent those controls. In my analysis, what Japan did was raise the reputational and financial cost of sanctions evasion for a whole range of secondary actors across Asia and beyond. When a country of Japan's economic weight, with Japan's deep integration into global trade and financial systems, draws a clear line and enforces it rigorously, it changes the compliance calculus for companies, banks, and governments that do business with Japan and do not want to jeopardize those relationships by being caught helping Russia work around the restrictions. This is sometimes called the extraterritorial effect of economic statecraft, and in my analysis, Japan's participation in the sanctions regime has meaningfully amplified that effect across the Indo-Pacific region in a way that a purely Western-led coalition simply could not have achieved on its own. Think about it from the perspective of a mid-sized Southeast Asian bank or trading company. If the sanctions pressure is coming only from the United States, the European Union, and the United Kingdom, that is significant, but it can potentially be managed if the business relationship with Russia is valuable enough. But when Japan is in that coalition too, and Tokyo is making clear that it is watching, that it is coordinating with Washington and Brussels on enforcement, and that relationships with the Japanese financial system and Japanese industrial partners carry real conditionality, the calculation changes. The number of entities willing to stick their necks out to help Russia access restricted technology, dual-use goods, and financial channels starts to shrink. Based on publicly available reporting from the United States Treasury Department and from European regulatory bodies, there has been an ongoing and increasingly sophisticated effort to track and disrupt the networks through which Russia has sought to import restricted technology, particularly semiconductors and microelectronics needed for weapons manufacturing. That effort has had more success than is often reported, though it remains incomplete, and in my analysis, Japan's role in that effort, both through its own export control enforcement and through its influence on the behavior of regional actors, has been one of the underappreciated factors in making that disruption more effective. Now let me add one more layer here, because I think it is essential to understanding the full picture. Japan's recent decisions around its own defense posture go beyond Ukraine specifically. According to publicly available reporting from Japanese government sources and from defense analysts at institutions including the International Institute for Strategic Studies, Japan has committed to a significant increase in its own defense spending, moving toward 2% of GDP in line with NATO guidelines, which represents a historic shift for a country that had maintained a roughly 1% ceiling for decades. Japan has also revised its national security strategy. Documents to include language about counterstrike capabilities, meaning the capacity to strike targets on the territory of an adversary if Japan determines that an attack against it is imminent or underway. These decisions are primarily framed in the context of Japan's concerns about China and North Korea, but in my analysis, they are not irrelevant to the Russia-Ukraine equation, because they signal something important about the direction of Japanese strategic culture, a Japan that is rearming, that is revising its constitutional interpretations around defense, and that is deepening its security cooperation with the United States, South Korea, Australia, and European NATO members, is a Japan that is increasingly embedded in a global security architecture that is structurally opposed to the revisionist agenda that Moscow and Beijing, in different ways and to different degrees, represent. That is a long-term structural development that cannot be easily reversed, and it represents a form of strategic closure for Russia that goes far beyond the immediate costs of the Ukraine war. What happens next, and this is my prediction, offered with the humility that any honest analyst should maintain. In my analysis, the trajectory we are watching is not a temporary wartime adjustment. It is a structural realignment that is going to outlast this particular conflict and reshape the geopolitical environment, in which Russia operates for years, possibly decades to come. Here is what I think is really happening at the deepest level. Vladimir Putin made a calculated bet in February 2022 that the international response to a full-scale invasion of Ukraine would follow a familiar pattern: initial outrage, some sanctions, some support for Kyiv, and then a gradual normalization as economic pressures, political fatigue, and the complexity of the conflict wore down Western resolve. He had historical precedent on his side. That pattern had played out before, and the bet was not entirely irrational given what had happened in 2008 and 2014. What Putin did not adequately account for, in my analysis, was the possibility that the invasion would trigger not just a temporary coalition of the willing but a genuine reconfiguration of how a wide range of countries, including countries with no direct stake in European security, understood their own long-term interests. Japan is the clearest example of this reconfiguration, because Japan had every reason, by the old logic, to hedge. It did not hedge. And the reason it did not hedge, in my reading of publicly available statements from Japanese government officials and security analysts, is that Tokyo made a judgment that the precedent being set in Ukraine was directly relevant to Japan's own security environment, specifically the precedent that a nuclear-armed great power can attempt to revise borders by force and face only limited international consequences. For Japan, that precedent is not an abstract European concern. It is an existential one, given China's posture toward Taiwan, its claims in the South and East China Seas, and North Korea's ongoing nuclear and missile development. Japan's calculation, in my analysis, was that allowing the Ukrainian precedent to stand without a robust and sustained international response would make its own security environment meaningfully more dangerous. And so Japan chose to absorb real economic costs in order to contribute to an outcome in Ukraine that it judged to be in its own long-term security interest. This is rational statecraft. It is not idealism. It is not sentiment. It is a cold-eyed calculation that the rules-based international order, for all its imperfections, serves Japanese interests better than a world in which great powers can rewrite borders at will. And that calculation, in my analysis, is both correct and increasingly shared among a growing number of countries across Asia, Europe, and beyond. So what does this mean for Putin specifically and for Russia's position more broadly? In my analysis, it means that the coalition arrayed against Russia's war aims is more durable, more economically significant, and more geographically diverse than Moscow's original strategic model could accommodate. It means that the secondary pressure on countries that might otherwise help Russia evade sanctions is more intense than it would be in a purely Western-led effort, and it means that the long-term reputational and economic isolation of Russia from advanced technology supply chains, from major financial systems, and from the most dynamic parts of the global economy is proceeding along a trajectory that will be very difficult to reverse, regardless of how the military situation on the ground in Ukraine evolves. I want to be careful here, because I am not predicting a quick or decisive Russian collapse, either militarily or economically. The honest assessment, based on publicly available data, is that Russia has demonstrated a disturbing capacity to sustain this war through a combination of wartime economic mobilization, suppression of domestic dissent, revenue from energy exports to non-sanctioning countries, and the acceptance of extremely high human costs that a democratic government could not politically survive. Russia is not powerless in any absolute sense. But what Japan's moves contribute to, in my analysis, is a gradual and cumulative tightening of the strategic environment around Russia that makes its long-term position increasingly untenable. Think of it less like a sudden collapse and more like a slow compression. Each additional country that aligns with the sanctions regime, each additional technology restriction that gets enforced, each additional defense relationship that deepens among the countries arrayed against Russian revisionism adds another increment of pressure. No single increment is decisive on its own, but over time, the cumulative effect of that compression is significant, and Japan's participation, given the scale of its economy, the sophistication of its technology base, and its influence across the Indo-Pacific, represents one of the more significant increments in that cumulative process. There is one more dimension I want to address before we move to implications, and it is the dimension that I think is most often left out of the analysis entirely. It has to do with what Japan's moves signal to other countries in Asia that are watching this situation very carefully and making their own calculations. South Korea is one of the most important of these. According to publicly available reporting, South Korea has navigated a complex position in the Ukraine conflict, providing humanitarian aid and non-lethal support while stopping short of direct weapons transfers, in part because of its own complex relationship with Russia and its concerns about Chinese reaction. But South Korea has also been deepening its defense cooperation with the United States, with Japan, and with European partners in ways that reflect a similar underlying calculation to Japan's, namely that the precedents being set in Ukraine carry direct implications for the Korean Peninsula and for the broader security architecture of Northeast Asia. Australia is another country worth watching in this context. Australia has been one of the more robust supporters of Ukraine outside of Europe and North America, contributing military equipment and financial aid at a level that reflects a similar judgment to Japan's about the systemic stakes of the conflict, and Australia, like Japan, has been deepening its own regional security architecture through mechanisms like AUKUS, the trilateral security partnership with the United States and the United Kingdom that is focused primarily on the Indo-Pacific. What I see emerging, and this is my broader analytical thesis, is the early architecture of a security ecosystem that links European and Indo-Pacific democracies in ways that would have seemed quite unlikely a decade ago. The war in Ukraine has functioned as an accelerant of this process, pushing countries like Japan, South Korea, and Australia into deeper alignment with European NATO members around shared concerns about great power revisionism. And that emerging ecosystem, if it continues to consolidate, represents a genuinely transformative development in the global balance of power, one that reduces Russia's room for maneuver not just in Europe but globally. Now let us talk about implications, because if this analysis is correct, there are specific things that I believe we should be watching for in the next 30 to 60 days that will either confirm or challenge the thesis I have been developing. The first thing to watch is the evolution of Japanese defense export policy. Based on publicly available reporting, there have been ongoing discussions within the Japanese government and among its coalition partners about further relaxing the constraints on defense-related exports, potentially including provisions that would allow Japan to export certain categories of equipment more directly to countries in active conflict situations. Any announcement or legislative movement in this direction would be a significant signal that Tokyo is continuing to move along the trajectory I have described, and it would represent a further meaningful contribution to the coalition. Supporting Ukraine. The second thing to watch is the behavior of Asian financial institutions with respect to Russia-linked transactions. If Japan's participation in the sanctions regime continues to amplify the reputational costs of sanctions evasion across the region, we should expect to see continued tightening of compliance behavior among banks and financial intermediaries in Southeast Asia, the Gulf region, and other areas that have previously been identified as potential vectors for Russian sanctions circumvention. Reports from regulatory bodies and investigative journalism outlets tracking this space will be worth following closely. The third thing to watch is the diplomatic signaling between Tokyo and Moscow. Based on historical patterns, Russia typically responds to what it perceives as hostile moves by non-Western countries with a combination of rhetorical escalation and attempts to find leverage in areas of bilateral sensitivity. For Japan, that has historically meant Russian signaling around the Kuril Islands dispute, including statements about militarization of the islands or suspension of peace treaty talks. Any escalation in Russian rhetoric or posture toward Japan in the coming weeks could be read as confirmation that Moscow is feeling the pressure of Tokyo's alignment and is attempting to create costs for it, which would itself be a form of validation of the thesis that Japan's moves are landing in ways that matter to Russian strategic calculations. This is independent analysis only. I want to be clear about that as we close. I could be wrong about any of the specific predictions I have offered here. The situation on the ground in Ukraine remains fluid and deeply uncertain. The political durability of the coalition supporting Ukraine, including Japan's continued commitment, depends on domestic political conditions in each country that can shift in ways that are difficult to predict from the outside. The Russian economy, while under pressure, has shown more resilience than many analysts expected, and there are legitimate debates about the pace and severity of the long-term damage that sanctions and isolation are causing. What I am more confident about is the structural argument that Japan's decision to align clearly and at real economic cost with the international response to Russian aggression represents a significant and underappreciated development, that Japan's participation amplifies the effectiveness of the broader coalition in ways that go beyond its direct financial contributions, that the precedent being set by Japan's shift in defense policy and strategic culture is one that will have lasting effects on the regional and global balance of power, and that the cumulative pressure this coalition is generating on Russia's strategic position is meaningful even if it is not immediately decisive. If you take nothing else from this analysis, take this. The war in Ukraine has drawn a line in a way that previous Russian military actions did not, and the fact that Japan, of all countries, with all of its historical constraints and its complex regional position, chose to stand on one side of that line rather than hedge, tells you something important about how consequential that line is. Countries do not take costly, precedent-breaking decisions unless they believe the stakes genuinely justify it. Japan's judgment is that they do, and in my analysis, Japan is right. This is independent analysis only, not news, not official reporting. I could be wrong about any specific element of what I have argued here, and I genuinely encourage you to read the source material, think critically about the arguments, and form your own view. What is your take on Japan's strategic pivot? Do you think it will have the kind of long-term impact I have described, or do you think other factors will dominate the trajectory of this conflict? Drop your analysis in the comments. I read them, I take them seriously, and they make the conversation better. If this kind of deep-dive geopolitical analysis is useful to you, subscribe. I post every single day, and every single video is this same format: calm, sourced, analytical, and honest about uncertainty. All information in this video is based on publicly available reports and represents personal opinion and independent analysis only. Nothing here constitutes official reporting, verified intelligence, or professional geopolitical advice. The analyst could be wrong. Do your own research. Think for yourself.